From the bustling city streets of Tokyo to the stunning torii gates of Kyoto and the majestic beauty of Mount Fuji, Japan is a country rich in history, tradition and culture. And it's absolutely dripping in pop culture too, making Japan one of the best overseas destinations for vintage toy collectors. I've just spent 2 weeks holidaying across Japan and I did plenty of toy hunting along the way. So in this video, I'm going to discuss some of the best places to hunt for vintage toys in the land of the rising sun. We'll talk about why Japan is such a hotbed for vintage toys. I'll offer you some valuable tips that are well worth knowing before you go, and I'll be showing you all of the amazing toys that I picked up along the way. While this channel has never and will never be focused on the value of vintage toys, I am going to let you know what I paid for each toy so you can get an understanding of what these items cost in Japan. Because if you're considering a toy hunting trip to Tokyo, it's a pretty important thing to get your head around. Before I left, I set myself a budget of 250,000 yen, or approximately 1600 US dollars. And even though I'm based in Australia, so I was doing all of those kind of exchange calculations from yen to Australian dollars, I'll be discussing all of the items in this video and pricing them in US dollars because that's where the vast majority of my audience is. Now, while I had set this budget of 250,000 yen, I'm actually not sure how well I stuck to it. I don't know if I came in under. My gut's telling me I actually went way over. And I haven't had a chance to sit down and tally everything up just yet. I'm pretty sure I was naughty and I went over my budget. So as we go through this video, you'll find out alongside me whether I stayed within my budget or not. When we first arrived in Japan, we stayed in the nightlife district of Shinjuku at a hotel not far from the world famous Toho Godzilla cinema. And for my first toy hunting expedition, we travelled to Nakano, which is about 7 minutes away from Shinjuku if you get the rapid train from the Chuo line. Once you arrive at Nakano Station, Nakano Broadway, which was the destination I was heading for, is just a short walk from the north exit of the train station. And Nakano Broadway is kind of like a 4-story shopping mall which specialises in vintage pop culture collectibles. There are just tons and tons of stores in there. But the premier vintage toy store in Japan is Mandarake, and it's actually a chain of stores. There was about 7 or 8 different ones in Nakano Broadway, and several other Mandarake stores dotted across Tokyo and the rest of Japan, and I went to a few more than just what I found at Nakano Broadway. In one of these smaller Mandarake specialty stores, I came across a vintage carded Zartan action figure from the G.I. Joe line, but this was on the Japanese Takara card. And in a recent Patreon video message, I made this statement: if I come across a Zartan carded at a decent price, I'm going to bring that thing back home with me because, as we all know, in the US, in the UK, Zartan was never sold on a card back. Well, until they did that Ninja Force re-release, of course. But at 65,000 yen, which is approximately 420 US dollars, I didn't think this was a decent price, so I passed on the item. But it didn't matter because in the very same cabinet across the other side was this beautiful 12-inch Takara G.I. Joe accessory set, which features the machine gun, grenades and medal from the Russian infantry set, which was an original G.I. Joe set from the 1960s. And that was my very first toy purchase in Japan. And I was quite amazed that the very first item I picked up was, a Japanese themed item. I absolutely love the packaging design here. And this piece is going to be proudly displayed with my vintage G.I. Joe Soldiers of the World. And I picked this item up for 11,000 yen, which is around 70 US dollars. In this same small Mandarake specialty store, they had a ton of quite rare vintage Star Wars. And what really piqued my interest was the action figures that came in the small boxes that were only ever sold in that way in Japan. And if they had have had a Bespin Luke, I probably would have pulled the trigger, but he wasn't available on the day. But they did have some very nice examples, and it was very pleasing to see these things in the wild. Like, I've never seen them in person before, but I am well aware that this is how some of the Empire Strikes Back Star Wars figures were sold in Japan, in these solid boxes with the figures in baggies inside. In another shop inside Nakano Broadway, I came across this random figure. This is like 1/6 scale. I have no idea who this guy is, but I was fixated with it for a few moments because it kind of reminded me of Lio Convoy. Now, even though this Takara G.I. Joe accessory set ended up being the only purchase of the day, I still really enjoyed browsing the stores in Nakano Broadway because there was just some amazing old Japanese toys which I was just fascinated by. It was really awesome to see such a great selection available for sale. The next day we visited Akihabara, which is known as Japan's Electric Town and the epicenter for anime pop culture and offbeat maid cafes.
Oinky doink!
Oh. I hope I can be like her one day.
You'd have to give up being human then. Huh? She's off on a whole other planet.
In Akihabara, they have a huge Mandarake complex, which is 8 stories high, and I highly recommend getting the lift because the vintage toys are on floors 7 and 8, and I was completely puffed out by the time I walked up to the 8th floor using the stairs. But on that 8th floor of Akihabara's Mandarake, I came across this vintage boxed Doctor Who figure from the 1970s, and I never ever expected to find this in Japan. This particular version of the 10-inch tall Dennis Fisher Doctor Who, which is kind of like a Mego action figure, this one comes in an Italian Harbit box. And a number of years ago, there was a huge warehouse find of these Italian boxed Doctor Whos, so they're not insanely rare. Yet for some weird reason, so many of the people who are selling these on eBay have the figures missing the sonic screwdriver accessory. And they're also asking way too much for these pieces. This box is absolutely beautiful, and the figure comes complete with all of his clothing. He's got his signature scarf, his hat, and the most important thing is this toy has that sonic screwdriver accessory. And I've wanted one of these for a while so that I can display it with my recent acquisition of the talking Palitoy Dalek. So these two are going to go great together in my collection room. And I picked this item up for 30,000 yen, which is approximately 195 US dollars. And while this is certainly not a bargain, I was very happy with that price because I've eyed these up before and almost pulled the trigger at around $250, $300. So to get it for just under 200 bucks, I'm very happy. One of the big reasons that there are just so many awesome vintage toys available for sale in Japan is because in that country, the concept of thrifting is a really popular pastime. And in stores like Mandarake, they have separate sections where you can bring your items in and sell them directly to the store. So there is just this constant flow of rare collectible items coming through the doors and walking out of the doors, sometimes almost just as quickly, which is something I learnt about the hard way. As I left this particular Mandarake complex in Akihabara, I spotted an item in the outside shop window and my jaw hit the floor. This is an insanely rare late 1960s 12-inch G.I. Joe gift set. These gift sets were put out by Hasbro in the late 1960s because of the anti-war sentiment that was making military toys less and less popular, and G.I. Joe was moving into more the adventure team type stuff. They still had a lot of leftover military product. So what they did was took a talking G.I. Joe and 3 carded outfits, which in this case was the Japanese Imperial Soldier, the Russian Infantryman and the German Stormtrooper, and packaged them up into these gift sets to try and get rid of some of that leftover stock. And finding them mint in package today is very uncommon. And I was really tempted by this piece, but at 175,000 yen, I just couldn't pull the trigger on my 3rd or 4th day in Japan because that was going to blow almost my entire budget. So I didn't even ask the store staff to take the toy out of the display case and let me have a good look, so I don't quite know what was in it. And I walked away unsure whether I should have pulled the trigger or not. And I continued to obsess about this toy for the rest of the trip. After leaving the Mandarake complex, I went to a bunch of other stores, but one that particularly stood out to me in Akihabara was Golden Age Toys. And I unfortunately didn't get any footage in this store because my phone battery was running low at the time. But I do want to show you the single item that I picked up in that shop. And that is this beautiful shop stock G.I. Joe Scarlet figure on a vintage Takara G.I. Joe card back. This item is absolutely pristine. And while I may have passed on the Zartan that I saw in Nakano Broadway, I decided to pull the trigger on Scarlet because I thought she was priced much more reasonably, and she is one of the few first series G.I. Joe figures that I don't yet have in my collection. So I'm very pleased to add this to my vintage G.I. Joe display, and this carded action figure cost me 20,000 yen, which is approximately 128 US dollars.
G.I. Joe! 地上最強のエキスパートチーム G.I. Joe 登場。秘密組織コブラが君を狙っている。G.I. Joe! 地球の平和をかけて G.I. Joe は立ち上がった。SF アドベンチャーヒーロー、その名は G.I. Joe!
Now here's the first really important tip for toy hunting in Japan, and that is to carry cash, because even though they're like the Mandarake stores will take a credit card, a lot of these smaller specialty shops, they are cash only. And that was the case in Golden Age Toys. I had to pay cash for this carded Scarlet action figure. So if you're hunting in Japan, take your credit card and take a lot of cash. A couple of days later, we visited another part of Tokyo called Shibuya. And this area is known for having the world's busiest pedestrian crossing. And Shibuya also has a Mandarake, but you should note that this one is about 5 floors underground. In this store, I found some really awesome vintage Disney products. There was some nice vintage Star Wars stuff, but the cabinet that caught my eye the most had this amazing boxed Mego Planet of the Apes action stallion, as well as a vintage Popey Spider-Man. One Japanese item I would love to get while I'm there would be a vintage Popey Spider-Man. And if I do find a nice boxed, I mean, it wouldn't even have to be boxed, but it would have to be complete. So even though I really wanted to pick up a complete Popey Spider-Man, this item at just 4,000 yen, I couldn't say no to. Now, while this figure does have a broken left arm and he needs a little bit of cleaning up, at 4,000 yen, which is about 25 US dollars, I was not going to leave this one behind. And I also decided to pull the trigger on the Mego Planet of the Apes action stallion. Because even though I don't collect Mego's Planet of the Apes range, I do collect other Mego stuff. The box is a little faded, but it's still in quite nice condition, but I want to display this toy loose. And the main reason I picked this up, I thought this would be an excellent way to display my vintage Mego Conan figure, which I picked up at Joe Fest a couple of years ago. Now, when I was making this purchase in the Shibuya Mandarake, I was trying to ask the guy if the toy still worked, but his English wasn't great, and I thought, sod it, I'm going to buy it anyway. And this item cost me 25,000 yen, which is approximately 160 US dollars. And while that is kind of the top end value for what this item is worth, I was very pleased when I got home to find out that this action stallion does still work. Although it makes a hell of a racket once you get the batteries in it. Another top tip for toy hunting in Japan is to take your passport with you everywhere you go. Because in Japan, there is a 10% sales tax. And if you spend over 5,500 yen, you can get that 10% sales tax back. But you must have your passport with you so that they can scan your visa. And particularly when you're shopping in the Mandarake stores, you have to actually pay the tax first and then go to the tax-free counter with your passport and your receipt, and they give you that tax back in cash, which was pretty good for me because I was spending money on my credit card and it was almost like an easy way of getting a little bit of extra cash into my wallet without having any foreign transaction fees to worry about. Unfortunately, I didn't know about this when I purchased the Doctor Who item, so I left some money on the table there. But when I was shopping in the Shibuya Mandarake, the staff told me about this and I happened to have my passport on me. So it was a very short transaction, but I was pleased to walk away with my 10% back. The following day, we left Tokyo and headed to Mount Fuji. And while there was no toy hunting done in Mount Fuji, I do highly recommend that place as somewhere to visit. It's absolutely beautiful to see that volcano in the center of Japan. And I would like to give a massive shout out to the tour guide that we met on the trip. He was a really, really nice guy, spoke excellent English and took us to some fantastic Mount Fuji viewing spots that weren't teeming with tourists. He knew some little secret locations. And if you're heading over to Japan and you want to go to Mount Fuji, I highly recommend using this tour guide. I will leave a link to his Instagram in the video description below. Next, we travelled to the historic city of Kyoto on the Shinkansen bullet train, which is an experience all by itself, and I highly recommend it. And the best thing for me is that Kyoto had another mandarake store. And the Kyoto Mandarake was my favourite of all the toy stores that I went to. Not only did it have some really awesome stuff, but a lot of the shops in Tokyo, the aisles are very, very narrow, and when there's a lot of other customers in there, it can be quite crowded and difficult to get around and view all of the cabinets. But the Kyoto Mandarake has nice wide aisles. It's a beautiful layout. It's actually on the 4th floor of a department store. And I picked up some really awesome items, including my best bargain of the entire trip. While most of the vintage toys in these mandarakes are locked inside glass cabinets, there are other shelves where you can rummage through the toys, and these are mostly second-hand modern action figures. And as I was rummaging through one of these particular shelving units, I was stunned to come across a vintage Action Man role-play radio from the late 1970s. I must admit, I never expected to find anything Palitoy in Japan, let alone Palitoy Action Man and let alone vintage boxed Palitoy Action Man. This radio was part of a whole range of Action Man roleplay toys that Palitoy put out in the late 70s. And when I found this item sitting on the shelf for only 1,500 yen, which is about $9.60, I immediately pulled the trigger on it. To give you an understanding of just how much of a bargain this purchase was, I have seen broken, incomplete examples of this roleplay radio on eBay for around 20 quid or 25 US dollars. This one is mint and complete. In the box, it has all of the accessories, and it was the absolute best bargain of the entire trip. Certainly not something I expected to find, but something that I was very happy to find. Another item that I came across in the Kyoto Mandarake was this carded Gremlins piece, and I thought it was quite reasonably priced, but I didn't pull the trigger on that because I was just so worried about how I was going to package it up and put it in my suitcase and get all the way back to Australia without getting it damaged. So I left that one behind for the next collector. But something I did pick up is this naked 1960s G.I. Joe action figure. And this guy cost me 6,000 yen or 38 US dollars. He came completely naked apart from this strange waistcoat, which is not even a G.I. Joe item. But I have some spare uniforms in my parts bin, so I can get this guy dressed up, and he's going to fit in perfectly with my vintage 1960s G.I. Joe display. One of the main reasons I really enjoyed toy hunting in Japan, and this is what makes it an absolute mecca for toy collectors, is that they have some truly vintage pieces. What I mean by that is most stores I've been to elsewhere focus on 70s and 80s toys and sometimes 60s toys, whereas Japan has some really old stuff dating back much, much further. There are incredible tin toys from the 1950s that can be found all over the place. And even though I don't collect 1950s tin toys, it was still really awesome to see them all over the place on this trip. Something I do collect though is vintage Star Wars, and the biggest purchase of my entire trip was this large size Boba Fett from Kenner.
Do or do not. There is no try.
The box is a little beat up, but the toy is mint and complete inside. It has the original backing insert inside the box. And at 60,000 yen or 385 US dollars, I thought it was a very reasonable purchase. It certainly wasn't a bargain like the Action Man radio, but I couldn't say no to it. Especially considering that I used to have one of these in my collection and I sold it many years ago, and I've always regretted that. So not only was this the most expensive purchase of my trip, it was also the biggest. And again, I was quite worried about how I was going to package this up and get it into my suitcase and get it home without getting it damaged. But we're past that now. I'm back in Australia and I'm very, very pleased to add this vintage large size Boba Fett action figure to my Star Wars display. I spent several hours in the Kyoto Mandarake, and one of the best parts of the experience for me is that I did this toy hunting trip with my father, the toy soldier collector who inspired me to become a collector in childhood. And by this point I'd picked up the Action Man radio, the naked G.I. Joe and the large size Boba Fett, but I wasn't done yet. The next item I acquired is this beautiful boxed Yoroiden Samurai Troopers action figure. I'm not a huge fan of Japanese toy. I don't collect any Japanese stuff. This is based on a cartoon that I know absolutely nothing about, and as you saw in that Patreon message, I don't collect Japanese toys. But there was something about this piece that just spoke to me. I loved the packaging design, and the toy looked awesome, and it has never been played with. Inside the box, the action figure and all of the accessories are laid out in the styrofoam, the way that companies like Bandai and Takara always used to sell stuff back in the 1980s. This is a super awesome piece. I don't know whether I got a good deal on this or not, but I paid 25,000 yen for this item, which is around 160 US dollars. And it's just proof that in Japan, you never know what you're going to find. You never know what kind of toys are just going to speak to you. And this particular item, it spoke to me and I couldn't walk away without it. Of course, it should come as no surprise to anyone that Transformers is really big in Japan. Although some of the prices for those vintage Japanese packaged Transformers were just mind-blowingly insane. And for anyone who's watched this channel for any length of time, you'll be aware that I'm not a huge fan of Transformers, but I did almost pull the trigger on a vintage one. While still in the Kyoto Mandarake, I came across this original boxed micro-change transforming pistol. And I was very, very tempted by this item, but the fact that it looks like a gun and it actually fires plastic pellets, I wasn't too worried about the price of it. I was more worried about how I was going to get this back through Australian customs. And I thought, I'm not going to drop 300 Australian dollars on an item that might get confiscated as I go through passport control. Before leaving Kyoto, we had to make a trip to Nara Park, and if you're in Japan and you go to this city, I highly recommend it. You can go there and you can feed the deer. Towards the end of our holiday, we travelled back to Tokyo, and I was still obsessing about that gorgeous 1960s G.I. Joe gift set. So I headed straight back to the Mandarake complex in Akihabara. I went straight over to the window where I'd seen it about 10 days earlier, and the whole section where it was displayed was empty. The piece was gone and I was crushed. For me, it was a very stark reminder of that old collecting saying, the time to buy it is when you see it, because you just never know when you're going to see it again. And even though 175,000 yen might seem like a lot, as I said, I'm never going to know the truth because I didn't ask the staff to take it out of the box and show me what was inside. But if that was a complete set, that was an absolute bargain, and I'm still gutted that I left that one behind in Japan. So to get over my funk, I headed straight back up to the 7th and 8th floor of the Mandarake complex and thought the best thing I can do now to get over my funk is to go and buy some more vintage toys. And I had a little bit more time up my sleeve when I went to the Mandarake complex in Akihabara this time around, which gave me the opportunity to do a bit more digging, and I saw some items that I didn't see on the first trip. And I was able to pick up a couple of really nice Kenner Superpowers action figures. I've been trying to complete Series 1 of this line for quite some time now, so it was nice to fill one of those gaps while I was on holiday in Japan. And that gap came in the form of this nice and complete Hawkman action figure. And this one is really minty. The vintage Hawkman figures from this line often suffer from the dreaded nose rub. This one's got all the yellow paint still on his nose, he's got his accessory, he stands really well, his action feature still works. And I picked him up for 12,000 yen, which is the equivalent of about 76 bucks. I also picked up a Parademon, and even though this figure was part of the later waves of superpowers and he's missing his accessory, at only 6,000 yen or 38 US dollars, I pulled the trigger on this guy as well. Now before I left Akihabara, I wanted to check out a few of the other toy shops in the local area, but I made one more purchase in the Akihabara Mandarake before I left. And that was this vintage G.I. Joe French Resistance fighter. Now he is missing quite a few of the accessories, but that doesn't really matter because I just wanted the figure. And I paid 18,000 yen for this guy, which is 115 US dollars. And even though he comes with very few accessories, you might be wondering why this guy was priced significantly higher than the naked G.I. Joe that I'd picked up in Kyoto. Well, that's because this guy has the foreign face without the scar. And these figures were only sold in the 1960s as part of the G.I. Joe Soldiers of the World range. And they are a lot more difficult to find than the standard G.I. Joe with the scar on his face. The figure itself is in really good condition, so I don't have any regrets paying the price that I did for this piece. And I'm looking forward to getting him into a different outfit and also adding him to my vintage 12-inch G.I. Joe display. While I have primarily focused on vintage toy hunting in this video, rest assured that Japan is also an absolute mecca for modern toy collectors as well. And there are all kinds of thrift stores all across Tokyo and the rest of the country. Some of the most well-known ones are called Hobby Off, and people can sell their items in these stores and pick up nice modern items at reasonable prices because they're second-hand. So I decided to finish off my trip by purchasing 3 Mafex Terminator action figures. This is my first ever Mafex purchase, and the idea behind it was I've got a plan to talk about these action figures in an upcoming video. And at 29,000 yen or 185 US dollars for the set of 3, I thought it was a very reasonable price. And the reason I know that is because I checked the sold listings on eBay. And that is my final top tip for toy hunting in Japan, is to get an eSIM before you go and make sure you have mobile data. You'll need it to be able to use Google Maps to find your way around the city, otherwise you're going to get completely lost. And when you're in these stores toy hunting and you want to compare prices, you want to be able to look at currency exchange rates, if you want to look at sold listings on eBay, you're definitely going to need to have mobile access while you're in Japan. And don't worry, this video isn't sponsored. I'm not going to go into a big advert about which eSIM to use. Do your own research. Just I recommend sorting out an eSIM and getting yourself mobile access while you're traveling around the land of the rising sun. To cap off our trip to Japan, we did a day trip on the bullet train up to Yuzawa to see the snow, because my wife and son had never seen snow before, and I found Yuzawa to be absolutely gorgeous. But now that I'm back in Australia, it's time to tally up the cost of all these amazing items that I picked up and figure out whether I stayed within my budget or not. So we have the Takara G.I. Joe accessory set for 11,000 yen, the Denny's Fisher Doctor Who for 30,000 yen, the carded Takara Scarlet for 20,000, Popey Spider-Man at 4,000, the Mego Action Stallion at 25,000 yen, the Action Man Radio at 1,500 yen, a naked G.I. Joe for 6,000 yen, the large size box Boba Fett at 60,000 yen, the Yoroiden Samurai Warrior at 25,000, the Superpowers Parademon for 6,000 and Hawkman for 12,000 yen, the Foreign Face Vintage G.I. Joe at 18,000 yen, and the 3 Mafex Terminators at 29,000 yen. And when I just added this all up, I was amazed at how close I came to my budget. I didn't go over. I spent a total of 247,500 yen, or approximately $1,585. And with a budget of 1,600 bucks, I came back with $15 in my pocket. I've said it before and I'll say it again. One of the best things about toy hunting in Japan is that you just never know what you're going to find. And I honestly didn't realise how many amazing toys I'd picked up until I got back, because throughout the trip, as I made purchases, I was boxing everything up and putting it in the suitcase. It wasn't until I got home after 2 weeks, unpacked everything and laid it out on the table, I was quite gobsmacked at the collection that I brought back with me. And I can't wait to go back to Japan and do it all over again. The place is absolutely beautiful. The food is incredible. And the people are some of the most polite, generous, kind, and just interesting people that you'll ever meet. The highlight for me was the Japanese people. I really enjoyed their company and their conversations whenever I got the opportunity to converse with them. So if you've even had an inkling of traveling to Japan, I recommend that you don't hesitate. Start planning a trip, get yourself over there, because you will not regret it, especially if you're a vintage toy collector. So thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, you can click the links over here to check out some of our other toy hunting expeditions, or subscribe to the channel by clicking down here, or consider supporting us on Patreon, where you'll get access to hours of exclusive content. I'm Tony from Analog Toys, and I'll see you in the next video.